lintas raya pada umumnya, serta sebagai ruang laboratorium pendidikan dengan film sebagai media penyampai.
Iya, betul sekali, Robi.
In Indonesia, there are hundreds of film communities who make and screen short films outside of mainstream commercial cinema and gallery spaces. The screening can be thought of as a performative event where a temporal community gets together to watch and talk. My friend Adrian once told me, if you want to understand Indonesia, you have to watch short films. These films reflect on and act upon local social issues, such as, for example, environmental degradation or the brute operations of morality politics on non-normative bodies. Cinematic practice becomes an aesthetics of form-giving to a very particular kind of situated knowledge, knowledge that emerges from and participates in concrete social situations. Watching these films, it became very clear to me that the labor of analyzing and interpreting social situations, activities that mark the domain of the researcher, is being done by the filmmakers. And this shows beautifully that countries of the South do not need external researchers who become experts on their countries. Representing the world as their own, in their own terms, they are doing this work already. Yet, most of these works would never be taken as valid scientific knowledge, but easily be dismissed as fictional, experimental, or amateur works. Departing from such judgments, I would like to think of my work as a conceptual space to valorize and to explore the potentialities of these epistemologies of the South. I'm doing this research perhaps at the margins of anthropology, a discipline that is for a long time the playground for adventurous white men to go out into the world and take back with them stories and make careers out of stories that were never theirs. And even beyond the discipline, up until today, many researchers and artists alike are complicit in cognitive extractivism. How do I, as a scholar, as an anthropologist, as someone who is ultimately also involved in the business of knowledge production and dissemination, navigate in this community that is established over the course of the research? How does one develop a non-extractive methodology, one that moves beyond the tangential nature of knowledge production? I'm taking cues from Trinity Minha and her notion of speaking nearby. What she said already back in 1982, when there was much less criticality about these issues, was that you cannot simply speak about your subject as if they were absent. You cannot simply speak about on the very shaky grounds of your own interpretations and point your finger far away. Speaking nearby means that you act as if the person is right next to you, no matter if that person is actually present or absent. It means that the person can speak back. So how does this imperative translate into practice? You have to make yourself vulnerable. You have to engage in a conversation, not only during the research and the interviews, when you're collecting the data, but also during the analysis, during the interpretation and theorizing. Knowing with, instead of knowing about, requires concrete participation. You have to understand yourself as part of a lasting community. And since a story once told does not end, ideally this community does not dissolve after the funding or the project is over. The question of this research cluster that my work speaks to most centrally is the question of how do communities get together in the first place. I got more and more interested in the question of how Indonesian film communities emerged in the first place. I realized that what I was interested in was a process. This is a departure from film studies or art criticism, where much of the discourse and critique centers on the art object. Instead, I conceive of artworks as nodes in ecosystem of collective knowledge formation, articulation and dissemination. From a process perspective, it does not make sense to start thinking with the notion of community. It is the end point. It implies the existence of some kind of entity that can be grasped. But the question I was interested in is, how do we get there? Undeniably, in Indonesia, the political situation with more freedom of expression in 1998 and the availability of affordable filmmaking technologies played a role. On a meta level, these circumstances provided the potentiality for people and things to enter into relation, to make films and to screen them. But I had a sense that there was still something missing. What activates this potential for relation and eventually the creation of communities? In neoliberal capitalism, this is money. You get the funds and you pay people and they enter your community of creating that work. But there are other ways of organizing, other social and moral grammars that bring people together. Many film productions and screenings in the ecosystem of Indonesian film communities are possible because of the support of friends and volunteers. Money is inevitably a part of these networks, but is not the primary currency. In many conversations, the being part of, being connected, being related as a necessary condition for things to happen crystallized as a prominent figure. This led me to suggest that collective practices are symptomatic of something deeper. My argument is that cinematic practice is rooted in a radical recognition of togetherness. And here I want to make some methodological remarks again. The argument that I'm putting forward here is not an extraction of their views, it's not a representation or a documentation of who they are. This argument is a response. It is a response from an encounter, from a conversation. It is an argument created in relation. This speculative approach allowed me to think through this idea of radical recognition of togetherness, asking, what if practices came from a place of radical recognition of togetherness? What would that create and what would it enable? With radical recognition of togetherness, I mean a mindset that as soon as you know of a social issue, you are responsible to do something about it. You don't need to be paid to enter a community if you perceive yourself as always already being part of it. The recognition of radical relatedness as a precondition explains differently why people dedicate their time to work on local social issues for free. It does not need the outside moral judgment of the good person. And this is also a way into rethinking the notion of care. Care is not normative, it's not prescriptive, it's not an inherent character trait, but it is a process of relating. The logic of its genesis is that of responsiveness to a given situation that is rooted in a radical recognition of togetherness, of becoming with. This kind of worldview is the antidote to neoliberal capitalism, the Cartesian self and human exceptionalism, the false consciousness of human disconnection from our environment that has led us down the spiral of environmental and social issues. But there are other worldviews, not only in Indonesia, but also in the so-called West. The dominance of the West and Western ways of knowing and making the world are not geographical, but epistemological. The West is not a place, it is a legitimizing project. The American biologist Lynn Margulis argued that we are all made of collaborative bacteria, and that symbiosis and not the survival of the fittest or competition are the drivers of evolution. Her formative paper appeared in 1967, after it was rejected by more than 15 journals. The worldview of collaboration was dismissed from becoming legitimated knowledge because it did not fit the capitalist colonial enterprise. How we perceive of our being in the world makes all the difference, because it determines how we act in the world. The question at stake is, are we independent or interdependent? In order to change things in the world, we need to be attuned to it differently, and the performativity of cinematic practices enables that.
Oke, kalau saya tadi melihat mulai dari cuan sampai tukarnya itu sebenarnya mengangkat isu-isu yang sangat-sangat sensitif, tapi dengan kemasan yang begitu menyenangkan. Mungkin kita langsung saja, apa sih sebenarnya yang ingin disampaikan dari ketiga film tersebut?
Isu-isu yang sepertinya menarik untuk dibahas lebih lanjut, terutama soal perempuan dan tentang reproduksi seksual. Nah, gitu. Kemudian ketika aku masuk di jurusan ini diisi, habis itu tiba-tiba aku terpikir, ini kok kebanyakan hantu-hantu kalau di Indonesia tuh perempuan semua, ya nggak sih? Pernah nggak kalau ada hantu?
Through the creation of cinematic and social spaces, a sense of interdependence is created. Screening discussions center on social issues much more than cinematic formalism or aesthetics. There is no absolute truth, it is a process. What is put forward by Indonesian film communities is not alternative knowledges, but alternative conventions of collective knowledge production and dissemination. These are temporal communities where participants are not merely receivers but active contributors. This is reminiscent of what Donna Haraway portrayed as play, an improvisational and speculative practice that is rooted in taking chances with one another. Or what Moten Harney calls study. Study is a collective speculation as a mode of production. And this is the political potentiality of the temporal community of a cinematic performance. To enter into this mode of study together in dialogue, because it is in these spaces where the potentiality of relating to the stories on screen and the realities off screen is created. With political, I don't mean the masculinist project with identifiable heroes who will turn into monuments, but micro-political attunements in concrete situations brought into being through the collective agency of entangled assemblages.